So we're going to start with something called the Amarna letters. Let's see if I always spelled that wrong. So this was, first of all, this is a discovery. So we'll talk about the discovery, and then I'll talk about something that I think is kind of interesting out of it. But so these were a bunch of clay tablets that were found in Amarna, which is one of, at different times Egypt has had different capitals. So Egypt has had capital cities in various places. So it's not like the U.S. where, for the most part, we've been in Washington, D.C. Different pharaohs would choose to locate their capital city in different places. So for a while, they were in southern, which is upper Egypt, because the southern part, if this is Egypt here, the southern part is very mountainous. And then the northern part, where the Nile Delta is much lower. It's more like valleys. This would be then the Red Sea and then the Sinai Peninsula here. So this part down here, even though it's southern, is actually called Upper Egypt because it's high in the mountains. And then this is Lower Egypt, even though it's in the north. So Memphis is down here, closer to the mountains. This was the capital city for a while. During Joseph's time period, the pharaoh who took over right before Joseph, so the one that was pharaoh while Joseph was in slavery, it was his son that had just sat on the throne when the butler and baker were thrown into prison. Right around that time, it was their attempted murder of the older pharaoh. He was wounded in the battle, and his son then returned, and there was no number two, no vizier, because he was most likely the one implicated in the treason. And so that's why the position was vacant when Joseph then was promoted. So his father, the one who was attacked by the vizier, the butler and the baker, moved it from Memphis up to the northern part near the Delta, which is then where it was for the entire period of Moses' time, Joseph's time. They were all up here in this region. And so it would bounce around through different places, but this was one of the capitals of Egypt. During the time period of probably Joshua through Judges, right around there, a lot of that time period, this was the capital. And so these were clay tablets that were found in the capital, and it deals with conversations between the pharaoh here and some kind of loyal city-state areas, this being the promised land up here, and this being Israel, say Jerusalem here, in these regions here, so the bottom part of Galilee and then above Jerusalem, Egypt had some influence. So it wasn't just that Egypt stayed in their zone only. There were various times when Egypt would press through, take hold of certain areas here, and often, even during the time period of Joshua and Judges, Egypt would set up command posts to keep an eye on these regions. Even though the Bible doesn't really talk about that, Egyptian history talks about them having some presence in the Promised Land during these time periods. And so these Amarna letters were conversations back and forth between Canaanite cities here that were kind of friendly with Egypt, right? And so it's kind of interesting because then this is the period of Joshua and Judges. Before this is really Israelites' territory, it is still predominantly controlled by these different Canaanite city-states. And so the Amarna letters give us some insight into what life was like, not only before Israel, but during, I think, Israel's entrance. So they reference a people called the Hipiru. Some places take the H off and just Hipiru, but so this sounds very much like what they called themselves, which was Hebrew. And so many people believe that this is when these Canaanites are writing about the Hipirus, that they're talking about the Hebrews. That's their word for the Hebrew. And what this meant was they called them the displaced people. The displaced people is what the Canaanites called them. So it was this large group of people during this time period who had moved into the Promised Land and didn't have any land of their own and were going from city to city attacking Canaanite cities, trying to overthrow them because they didn't have a land of their own and they were trying to get that. So sounds very much like this Hipiru would be the Hebrews of that land. So it's kind of interesting to hear them talked about from the side of the Canaanites who were living in the land, because they had financial and political dealings with Egypt. So in some ways, you're getting some of these Canaanite cities complaining to Egypt, hoping maybe for Egypt's help to kind of fight against the Israelites. And so that's kind of some of what is dealt with in these letters. It covers a lot of things. In fact, I think I'd like to try and get a hold of. So I think they have the actual full text of these things available. So I think that would be kind of interesting to read. But so I know part of it is it's talking, it's interesting that these Hipiru are mentioned, and it talks about them overthrowing different regions. And then one of the things that it discusses is their fear that other Canaanite city-states will partner with them. So that was one of their big fears, was that some of these other Canaanite regions. Just want to make sure my phone's off here. That these other Canaanite city-states were going to form alliances with the Hipirus, and then kind of start overthrowing some of the Canaanite city-states. So it's kind of interesting because that is one of the very first things that happened as soon as the Israelites moved into the Promised Land. You get the people of Gibeon were partnering with them. So it's possible that the reason that these Canaanites who are writing back to Egypt are talking about their fear that city-states are going to form alliances with these people is because possibly Gibeon had already taken place. Like the alliance from the Gibeonites with the Israelites, with Joshua, might have already taken place at this point, which would then naturally cause some of these other cities to wonder if other people were going to partner with them, and then they're left out in the cold. So that was a big fear. And they said that they were going from city to city, just trying to kill and destroy, basically. So it's kind of interesting to see from somebody else's point of view, the Israelite attack seems kind of unfounded. That this was their land, and here are these people coming in because they don't have anywhere to live, and they're just destroying city after city. And so, kind of an interesting perspective. But one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this story, now this is where, on my part, the speculation enters. I think this is pretty, even though you can't necessarily say that like linguistically, even though Hebrew sounds like Hebrew, you can't necessarily prove that that is a reference to Hebrew. I think the context itself lends itself that here in the Promised Land you get this large group of people going from city to city. I mean, it sounds like Joshua and them. So I think we're on pretty good standing to say that this is a reference to the Israelites who had moved into the land. But then it talks about in the letters another tribe of people that were in here. So these are all Canaanites. Another interesting thing is the language here that they're writing in is like an Akkadian kind of form, which was a precursor to Hebrew. So Hebrew kind of emerged out of that. So that might explain perhaps why they were able to communicate with these people. Because if you think about it, the spies who were sent to Rahab were able to talk with her with no problem. And so the language that these Canaanite cities wrote to Egypt in is kind of a precursor to Hebrew, kind of like the parent language that Hebrew was birthed out of. And so that might explain why they're able to communicate. And it might explain then, the Philistines apparently had a language that was very similar as well, because David went to Gath and was able to talk with them. And David had soldiers on his army who were Philistines. The Pelethites and the Terathites, those people, his bodyguard, those were Philistines.
And the Philistines talked to the Israelites in common.
Yeah, Goliath. Everybody understood Goliath, So there was a lot of commonality in the language. And then, but kind of the interesting story is that it talks about Shechem, right? Which for our purposes during this time period is important because the period of Joshua, if you remember, when they first get there, they go to Shechem and they did the covenant ceremony there, where you've got the two mountains, and one was blessing and one was cursing, and then the Ark of the Covenant was in Shechem right in the middle. And then they put half the tribes on one side, half the tribes on the other, and they performed the ceremony, and then they went back to Gilgal, right? So it's kind of interesting that there is no battle associated with them going to Shechem. They went in, they're fighting everywhere else. They fought Jericho, fighting at Ai. Every place that they go, they're having to fight. But then when they show up to Shechem, there is no mention of battle. They just kind of go in. They seem to be at peace. They perform the whole ceremony, and then they come back. So I think, at least there's a good possibility, that these texts give us a clue as to what happened. There is a tribe of people, it was a family, one family that had kind of grown large, that was living in Shechem at the time, according to these letters. And he mentions them by name, but it's interesting. He says that that family gave land at Shechem to the Hebrews when they invaded. And he says that he was somehow sympathetic to them because he gave them land, which would explain why they didn't have to fight for it, that when they came in. Now, the interesting thing is the person's name. And so that's what they're calling him in these letters, is the head of this tribe that's living in that area. Makes me wonder, could this be descendants of the tribe of Laban? That because Jacob was also in this area and Laban was there. Now then we know that Jacob left Shechem and those areas, did some traveling and things, ended up leaving totally out of that area and coming down to Egypt. So with a vacated Shechem, because none of the original people were there because Levi and Simeon killed them, so all of the people that were there in Shechem are gone now. Makes you wonder, did Laban's family pick up some of that land and live in that region? I don't know. It is kind of interesting that is the name of that family that had become large there and had settled in that land. And it would explain perhaps why they were friendly with the Israelites and gave them land, that they were related. So for whatever it is, someone with the name of Laban gave the Hebrew the land of Shechem when they invaded. And so So whoever that is, maybe it's not the Laban tribe, maybe it's just somebody else with a very similar name, but whoever it is, according to these letters, these Canaanites were a little aggravated because Shechem was given to this invading group of people. They didn't even have to fight for it. It was just given to them, which explains perhaps, the whole thing with the covenant that took place there. As soon as they came in, they just all settled and camped in Shechem. No battle or nothing. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting thought, at least, about how that could perhaps be true.
Because if they explained that they were the 12 tribes, which would have been of his nephew Jacob.
Yeah.
And, oh, your family.
Yeah, so they would have known, if that is true, they'd have known that they were family.
Probably who they were all along, even when they were coming back.
Yeah. And then, so then maybe that might explain then, too, why Joshua was willing to let them give them the land as opposed to just kill them. Because, with 2 or 3 million Israelites, even one large family didn't really stand a chance. So it's probably as much Joshua recognizing who they were as opposed to them recognizing who they were and wanting to give them the land. It's probably the other way around, that Joshua, for some reason, decided to have grace on these people because everywhere else that they went, they wiped them out. Yeah. All the Canaanites in the land, they were supposed to wipe out. Particularly, this is at the very beginning. So it would be very strange to see the Lord saying, oh yeah, leave this group of Canaanites in the land, because right at the very beginning, God was very particular that wherever they went, they were supposed to kill the people. So this might explain, maybe they weren't Canaanite. Maybe they were relatives of the Israelites. Kind of an interesting thought. And then another archaeological look here is with pottery, right? So in some of our archaeological books that we had in the archaeology class, you probably remember that the style of pottery was very much cultural. And so that it wasn't just a time period, that in a certain time all the pottery looked like this. It was more a particular nation tended to do its pottery in one way, and then that was the style for that nation. And so that's why pottery is a really important piece of archaeological excavations, because you can almost very easily tell what nation made it because of the style that they would use. And so to kind of just talk about the styles, the Israelite style, particularly during the time of David, was a red, like, kind of wash along the whole thing. So that's how you know it was Israelite pottery, is that it was red. So I don't know if there could be theological significance, but I think mostly it's just kind of interesting to kind of fill in the details about what they were using. It was solid red pottery, for the most part, is what the Israelites were using.
They didn't paint the outside or anything like that?
Yeah, so that's what this was. So it was like a red wash that they would dip it in. So it was like a covering of paint, and so red was the Israelite color that they would use. And then the Philistines painted theirs black and then used red paint for designs. So that was kind of the Philistine style. And so whenever they would find these things, then they would be able to determine who had made them. So one of the things that throws off some archaeologists, sometimes these guys, they do a good job of maybe site work, of digging and knowing, the site and handling that. Where they wreck up is in their interpretation, because that's just any individual's interpretation could be way off about how they're interpreting what they find. So they're professional in the dig process, but you got to watch them when it comes to figuring out what they say they think is the reason behind something. So I know in some of the Israelite territories, so you've got the coastal lands of the Philistines here, and then and so a lot of these border towns didn't have any Philistine pottery found in them, and so to me the obvious reason is because they didn't like each other, and they probably weren't buying pottery from them. It's their enemy nations, and so who wants to go over into Philistine camp to buy supplies? But the way they write it is that the biblical date must be off, because the Bible is trying to say that these cities were occupied by Israelites at the same time as they were occupied by Philistines. But clearly they must have been occupied at different times because they didn't have the pottery, is what they're saying. Is that, the Israelites must not have been there at the same time as the Philistines because they don't have any Philistine pottery. And that was the main pottery of the region. But probably the better way to understand that is they were enemies, and they probably didn't feel comfortable going to them to buy pottery. And so anyways, during David's time, what they would have had would have been like pottery dipped in like a red kind of paint coating, and that's what they used.
Where they felt about the Philistines, they probably wouldn't even want to use pottery that was made in that place.
Yeah, with a lot of their food laws and things, they didn't even want to eat around Gentiles, much less use their pottery if they could avoid it. All right.